Oh, my name is Jessie Martineau. I'm the host of the French Canadian Legacy podcast, and I'm very, very excited to be on the advisory board for the Association for the Advancement of French Language and Francophone Culture in the United States. As far as my story, I'm originally from Manchester, New Hampshire. I came up through the Catholic school system here, actually, from pre-K all the way through Trinity High School. I then went to DC, now where I got a BA in history from the George Washington University. I also have a JD from Temple University in Philadelphia. Though I'm back in Manchester, I'm very excited to be back in my hometown, actually, though obviously I have spent considerable time outside New Hampshire. Worked a number of different jobs. Among the work I've done is I've been a program aide in a school for children with autism. Was a junior high school American history teacher, actually 2-term state representative here in New Hampshire. I've coached women's rugby. I've been fortunate enough to be the coach at St. Anselm College and New England College. And I'm currently an academic advisor at Southern New Hampshire University. Now, a question I do get asked in interviews is when I kind of discovered my Franco-American heritage. And at least from my perspective, I can't remember a time where I was unfamiliar with my Franco-American heritage. I kind of always had it. I grew up with it. Both my parents actually spoke French in the house growing up. And at family functions, my grandparents, and we always had great aunts around also, they would all speak to each other. Both sides of the family would come over, and they would all speak to each other in French. So when we would get together for the holidays, the Christmas, Easter, New Year's, you could hear French in the house. So being around that culture, that heritage, that was something I was always aware of, for sure. My parents actually, they attended Catholic school, at least through 1st through 8th grade here in Manchester at a school, L'École Saint-Georges, that was taught half in French, half in English, which I think is kind of cool. They actually assumed that when a child showed up in 1st grade that they would be fluent in both, which kind of tells you the kind of place Manchester was at the time. And what I think is cool is that that was far from the only school here in Manchester where that was the case. There was a number of different schools that did the half French, half English thing. So I think that's very, very awesome. My sister and I were both baptized into a French church. Because at one point in Manchester, you could actually hear a French mass in 8 different churches, which is kind of wild to think about now. I can actually trace all my family back to Quebec. My dad's dad, Richard Martineau, he was born in Saint-Apollinaire. My other 3 grandparents were all born in Manchester. My dad's mom, Marguerite, so her maiden name is Bernard. Her family is from Saint Leonard d'Aston. My mom's mom, Irene Provencher, or Provencher, her maiden name was Glaude, and her family was from Saint George de Windsor. Now, my mom's dad, Roland Provencher, his father, who I'm actually old enough to have known, we call him the old Pepe, which I think is kind of funny. He was from Saint Monique, which is actually kind of cool because that's where my sister and my godmother both get their names from, which I think is kind of fun. So all these towns I've had the opportunity to visit, which is kind of neat. So it wasn't until later, it wasn't until I was an adult, but I have been to Saint Apollinaire, Saint Leonard d'Aston, Saint George de Windsor, Saint Monique. Just an amazing experience to see some of these places where my family comes from. So I thought that was very, very awesome. Now, despite this background, my sister and I do not speak French. And that became particularly significant during one of these trips when I was with my dad, my uncle, and we visited Saint Leonard d'Aston, and they were actually able to connect with some relatives that they had known from many years earlier that they had kind of lost touch with. So to see them be able to reconnect was great. What was less great was the fact that I was not able to participate in that conversation because the relatives we had in Quebec did not speak any English. Now, why my sister and I do not speak French? First of all, it's super common in my generation. And it's kind of disappointing because for years and years and generation after generation, people lived in Manchester their entire lives spoke French. You hear like great grandparents who born, died in Manchester, lived entire life in Manchester, never having actually learned English because they never needed it. That was kind of the community we had at the time. But for whatever reason, my parents' generation, by and large, I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but by and large, did not teach their kids the language. And this isn't just true in Manchester. I've talked to people in Woonsocket, Lewiston, Lowell. There's a lot of that all through New England, at least. Even New York, I've talked to people in New York, it's kind of the same deal. It was around the same time when the language started decreasing. Now, as to why this is, I think that answer is super complicated. And it's one of the very many questions that I try to tackle on the podcast. Now, as far as how I got involved in Franco-American organizations, it was actually kind of a very random, but turns out very fortunate run-in at the water cooler at work. So one of my coworkers, also an advisor with me at SNHU, Dan Beaulieu, we were going took a walk to the water cooler, and for some reason, the topic of conversation started on some of the events that were coming up in Manchester, some of the Irish events that were coming up in Manchester. And it was awesome. I remember just talking to Dan how great it was that the Irish community was able to get together to pull off these events, but that we, and I kind of assumed he was a Franco-American also from the last name, but I was like, we need to do a better job telling our story. And so I kind of went on my soapbox about how we have a really good story that is just not being told. We need to do a better job telling it. And Dan, to his credit, was very patient. And when I was done my little rant, he kind of just told me I needed to get in touch with his brother, Tim. So I did. Now, Tim Beaulieu, for anyone who's listened to the podcast, he's actually the person who created the New Hampshire Puts-In Fest. Now, if you're not from New England, you're probably not that familiar with the New Hampshire Puts-In Fest. It is by far the biggest events we do here at the Franco-American Center in Manchester. It's awesome. Bunch of restaurants from the area all come down. It started at the ballpark here in Manchester, but now it's actually held at Anheuser-Busch down in Merrimack. It's right outside of Manchester, so not far. And so a bunch of restaurants come and tons of attendees. And when you come through, you get a t-shirt and you get a passport, is what we call it, a passport to put in that allows you to have one sample from every single one of the restaurants there. It is an absolute awesome day. There's a kids section. There's a stage with a band. It's actually where we announce our Franco-American of the Year. There's vendors there. It's just a really, really neat event. And the person behind all of that is Tim Beaulieu. So I got to meet Tim. And through that, I ended up volunteering at the very, very first Puts-In Fest, which led to me volunteering at the second Puts-In Fest. Soon enough, I was attending some of the other events being held by the Franco-American Center. And then eventually I ended up on the Board of Trustees, where I still remain today for the Franco-American Center here in Manchester. As far as how the podcast came about, again, a question which I get fairly often, which makes sense. For me, it was just a situation of after I'd been around the Board of Trustees for a while, I just remember thinking what I could do to possibly help tell the story. I just didn't feel like I was contributing as much as I wanted to, frankly, and I was trying to think of what I could do to get the story out there. Eventually, I thought of the fact that when I was an undergrad, I had done some college radio. I had a show, a sports show, called some both men's and women's basketball games. I actually got to do some minor league baseball for the Bowie Bay Sox, which was a blast. So I had the background in radio, and I thought maybe if I could pull off a podcast, that would be awesome. And I spent a lot of time doing a lot of research in the planning for the podcast, and just honestly just kept getting frustrated. I have virtually zero technical skills whatsoever. So I was very, very frustrated about how I was going to pull this off. And I wasn't really sure how I was going to be able to do it. So thankfully, I was able to get in touch with a great friend of mine, Mike Campbell. And the two of us kind of partnered on this project. And this project would never have happened in a million years without Mike's involvement. Never, never, never. Mike does everything besides the interviews. He does all the production, the editing. He handles all the social media. We have merchandise now. He handles all those sales. We have a Patreon. Mike handles all of that. So Mike is a huge contributor to this project. In fact, I think we actually get along pretty great because both of us is absolutely convinced that the other has the tough job when it comes to pulling off a podcast. I'm fortunate. I just get to do some research and interview some super interesting people. And that's kind of the format of the podcast. We hope to tell the past, present, or at least explore the past, present, and future of Franco-American heritage culture here in New England, but even more so now. Actually, we're getting a bunch of people from outside New England, but most of our episodes have been focused on New England. And so we asked, how did we get to where we are? What organizations, people are out there doing amazing things now? Question I think is kind of interesting. What will the Franco-American culture look like 20, 30 years from now? And these are all the things we hope to explore on the show. And we do it, like I suggested, through interviews, because I am not an expert in any of these topics. But I'm very fortunate to interview people who are. We've had a number of college professors, and we've had, I'm trying to think. We have researchers, writers, musicians, playwrights, movie directors, politicians, museum directors. We've had a lot. Novelists, poets. just a ton of really, really awesome, really interesting people that we have been able to have on the podcast and kind of get their perspective on this culture, this heritage. And it's been a blast to be able to meet quite a few of these individuals. Way smart, way interesting people that I've had the opportunity to meet through the podcast, which, before, honestly, when we started this project between Mike and I wasn't entirely sure, what our reach was going to be. I wasn't. But thankfully, I'm very excited to say that we've been able to connect with people, way more people than we ever thought we would, on both sides of the border. And I think that has been absolutely awesome. I know every time we get email from people who listen, it's exciting. So for sure, I'm not trying to minimize that at all. By all means, Mike and I get super excited when we hear from people who listen. But it is particularly exciting when we hear from somebody in Quebec who's excited about the work that Mike and I are doing. I think that is very, very awesome. So, it's just been a really neat project. And something else that we're actually working on now, which is kind of cool, is we have started a blog. That's kind of our newest thing. And in this blog, we ask, and so far it's been all have been guests on the programs. But although in the future, I'm sure there will be some who aren't. But anyway, we ask these individuals to answer the question of why they tell the Franco-American story. Seemingly a kind of a straightforward question, but I think it's super interesting to hear the answers that come back, because these, I can't believe some of the people we had the opportunity to get to know, but these are incredibly smart, incredibly talented individuals who could be writing or performing or researching or lecturing about anything, and yet they choose to dedicate much of their professional lives, if not their entire professional lives, to telling the Franco-American story. And so it's always fascinating to me to hear the story of why these individuals choose to do that. I think it's awesome. Now, a question that I probably should address, because I get asked a lot, is why I chose to name the podcast the French-Canadian Legacy. Why is it not the Franco-American Legacy? And for me, it's because I was, I'm going to be completely honest, completely unfamiliar with the term Franco-American until I got connected with the Franco-American Center. Growing up, we did not use, in our house anyway, we did not use the term Franco-American. We always called ourselves French-Canadian. That's kind of how we associated with it. We had, my best friend is Greeks, and there was, a lot of Irish families down the road. So in my neighborhood, you had the Greeks, the Irish, and the French Canadians. And that's That's just kind of how we refer to ourselves. So for me, that's why I chose to name, even though I know some people aren't super excited about the term French Canadian, but that's why I chose to name the podcast the French Canadian Legacy. And again, I just have to say I'm incredibly excited to be part of the Association for the Advancement of French Language and Francophone Culture in the United States. I gotta say, when the prevailing narrative seemed to have been for a long time, at least here in Manchester, that the Franco-American culture is dead. Or if it's not dead, it's at least dying. And I would always try to battle back that I didn't think it was dead. I didn't even think it was dying. I thought it was different. I thought it was changing. Because it's different doesn't necessarily make it inferior. And I was always kind of battling that, no, we're kind of still around. And for me to be a part of what's happening now, I have to say, I think it's a super exciting time to be a Franco-American. I really, really do. With all these new organizations, especially, I mean, this one, the Association for the Advancement of French Language and Francophone Culture in the United States, the idea that we can have an organization across the entire country of people all with a common cause. Whatever you want to call this, Franco-Americans, French Canadians, French. On the show, we've had Quebecois Americans, we've had French Canadian Americans, whatever we are, the descendants of those who inhabited New France. The fact that we can have these organizations now telling the story in a way that was never done before, connecting across the border with cousins in Quebec in a way that was never done before. I actually think it's a super, super exciting time to be a Franco-American. Far from the narrative that we're dying. I think it's awesome. Everything that's happening right now, I think is super, super exciting. So again, super appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this organization. I cannot wait to see what this organization is able to put together. And I'm excited to work with everybody because we clearly have a bunch of really talented people involved. So I super appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to getting to work.